Hey guys, my name is Stephen Tamman, and today we are going to start a new video study of part 4 of the Satanic Rebellion series on Ichthys, titled Satan's World System. So here are some of the points we're going to go over today. We're going to start on why you might want to do this study in particular, as opposed to some of the other ones that Ichthys has. So Ichthys, for example, has a complete systematic theology. This series, as we're going to be doing a part of it, which covers the Satanic Rebellion, predating the history of mankind, and then a series on eschatology titled the Coming Tribulation series. So we'll start out just by explaining why this study in particular. And then after that, we'll go into Plato's Allegory of the Cave. Now, this serves as a useful parallel to some of the topics that we're going to be discussing in this study. And I like to use this as a way of framing how spiritual reality interacts with the illusory world before us. After this, we'll be talking about how Satan is ultimately the puppet master pulling the strings behind this world. And then we'll go through the outline on Ichthys, having covered most of this background information. Now, this week, we won't be spending too much time on the outline and we won't go in much depth, but in coming weeks, we'll be hitting sections of this at a much deeper level, going through more point by point. After all that, I'll just give a couple paragraphs of my introduction to this and why I think it's important for us as Christians. So in answering this question of why this study in particular, I've written several paragraphs here that I'm just going to read now. As a child, you may have heard adults talking about the way the world really works. For us as Christians, we believe in a spiritual dimension hidden from our physical sight, but very real nonetheless. This, in fact, is the crucial driving force behind reality, even though it is veiled from our eyes at present. At least for me as a teenager, Christianity was kept in its nice God-shaped box. There was the world in all its complexity, and then there was church and God stuff. Maybe somewhere deep down I knew the two were fundamentally linked, but it was never something that captured my thoughts explicitly. Then I read this study. This is one of the first things on Ichthys I read all the way through, and to borrow an idiom, it completely blew my mind. Ah, I said to myself, so this is what is beyond the illusion. At a high level then, this study helped me make heads and tails of what is actually important in life versus what people say is important in life, or what the illusion that Satan has set up for us says is important. This can have a somewhat disproportionately large effect on our lives as Christians, because once we realize the driving spiritual realities behind the world around us, it can become much easier for us to understand what our role in our walk as Christians should be and how we should interact with the world after that. Now, before we get too much farther in explaining this study itself, I find it useful to introduce this concept here of Plato's Allegory of the Cave. So in one of his works called The Republic, in sections 514 through 520, the ancient Greek philosopher Plato speaks of an allegory for life, humans chained to face a wall where illusions of shadow play before their eyes. This is all they know, so they think this is how the world actually works. Having never been exposed to true light, those in the cave think that the illusions of shadow are reality. In truth, those humans are enslaved, chained in a prison of their false perception. After being dragged into the light, it may take a while for these people's eyes to adjust. They've been used to only seeing shadows after all. Those in the cave will be resistant to the light, as it is bright and painful for their eyes adjusted to darkness. Moreover, things in the outside world don't compute in terms of cave logic. So, in great irony, those chained in the cave may mock those in the light as fools. This allegory is actually a great explanatory tool. For Plato, light served as a metaphor for philosophical truth. For us in our present study, light instead stands as a metaphor for spiritual truth. As we learn about how the world really works in this study, it will be possible to move further and further from the illusions of shadow, what Satan's world system would have us think are the actual realities, and more towards the light of spiritual truth. Now, the Bible itself does use light and darkness as a contrast, but what I like about the allegory of the cave is it introduces this idea of illusion. And what I mean by that is that there are things in the world that seem to be real and present themselves as real. However, once you dig down deeper and you put on your spiritual glasses, as it were, you find out that these things are just pretending to be important. And for us as Christians, this is very much the idea behind the fact that spiritual realities are veiled from our eyes. So you may have heard the expression eyes of faith. If we look with our eyes of faith, if we put on our spiritual glasses, like I said, it will be possible to see the spiritual dimension to life that we as Christians believe is actually the important dimension. even though it is not physically before us in the present. Now, the one who is trying to convince us that things of this world are important, sort of in lieu of our pursuit of spiritual matters, is Satan. And if you've never had someone explain this, I don't know, in so many words, it can seem a little bit shocking that Satan is actually the one in control of the world. So someone might ask, if God's omnipotent and God could crush Satan in an instant, then why does God let Satan control the world at present? Why is the devil and his minions the people in power? How does that make sense? And the final answer to this question is that God allows Satan to be in present dominion over us in this world because he's using Satan and his minions to test us. So Satan can't do anything that God does not allow him to do. In the book of Job, there is mention of Satan going before God in heaven to accuse Job. And as we'll get to in the outline, presently there's what is called the heavenly truce. So God allows Satan to do his thing on earth and even assemble with the elect angels in heaven, but this state of affairs is only temporary. In the final reckoning of things, Satan will be completely and utterly defeated when Jesus Christ returns in glory, and he will be thrown into the lake of fire forever. And of course, at that point, we will live on a new perfect earth with God, and there will be no more sin and no more suffering. So I'm bringing all this up just to say that when we talk about how Satan is in control of the world at present, this is only going to be a temporary state of affairs. Nonetheless, it is important for us to actually believe that this is the case and to not have any illusions or false views of how the world really works and who is pulling the strings in terms of, government and society and culture more generally, so that we don't try to make friends with the world and view these things as things that don't affect us negatively spiritually or things that aren't dangerous, rather than as they really are. So at a high level, the things that Satan puts before us in the world are illusions set up with intent. So that is to say, Satan doesn't just do things on a whim or with no purpose. He acts with specific strategy and tactics. And that's something that the outline in the study will talk a little bit more about, specifically to veil the truth from our eyes. And by truth, we're talking about spiritual truth. So the things the Bible contains, the spiritual realities that govern existence. So to escape this, we must learn how to critique the illusion around us, so recognize it for what it is and see the holes in it, and even learn how to look around it or through it, and instead see things as they truly are, so that we can achieve the freedom that the truth affords us. So this verse in John talks about the relationship between truth and freedom. This is actually a verse I like to use a lot because while we might not think of slavery or bondedness as often with respect to our minds, I think that in a great sense, being bound mentally is even more terrifying a concept than being bound physically. And one of the great things that spiritual truth affords us is that no matter what our physical circumstances may be, if we believe in eyes of faith, we will be completely set free by that faith. So we'll be set free from sin, and we'll also be set free from the lies of the world. And that specifically is what we're going to be talking about in this study. How, if we have faith and if we trust in what God has done for us, then even despite Satan's best efforts and all of his strategy and his tactics and the traps he set up before us, if we believe, we'll be able to navigate this web of lies that he has, because the truth will set us free. Now, there's this Greek word here, cosmos, that kind of describes the world system that Satan has. So it's not solely just the world as the physical entity, but also all of the human institutions that are set up. So societies and nations and governments and culture and all of these other things are all sort of set up, stacked against us to try to distract us from the spiritual realities. And all of these things are ultimately presided over by Satan, only at present, like we mentioned. So the main takeaway here is that we need to keep this in mind. We need to keep in mind that the world is in fact enemy territory for us, governed by our arch enemy who is seeking to distract us from the truth. And if we can keep these things in mind, that we are strangers in a foreign land and soldiers of Jesus Christ in enemy territory, we will be much more effective in our pursuit of the truth. Okay, Now we are going to be going through the outline for SR4 on Ichthys. So this is a long study, as you can see by the sidebar over here on the right, which means it is going to take us quite some time to work through it. Nonetheless, today we're just going to go over the outline at a high level. So this is part 4 of the Satanic Rebellion series on Ichthys, and in the 3 parts before it, one of the things that is covered is Satan's rebellion and fall from grace. So that is sort of a recap section. But once we jump into this study, the first big section is talking about how we're strangers in the devil's realm. So we're going to be sojourners in this world controlled by him. So this is not our home. This is not a place of comfort for us, but a strange land that we're led through. We're going to talk about the vanity of life. You might compare the book of Ecclesiastes here. So the pointlessness and futility of chasing after things in this world. We're going to talk about the hostility of the world. Something that comes to mind is how Jesus says that if the world hated and persecuted him, it will do the same things to us. Then we're going to talk about the concept of viewing life as a battlefield for us as Christians. So objectives and tactics and enemies who seek to harm or subvert our efforts in the truth. And of course, if we have a battlefield, then we have an enemy that we're fighting against. So the second thing after this just briefly goes over Satan's position after the fall. And then we pick up with Satan's order of battle. So you might think of this as how Satan arrays his troops against us and against the truth in the world. So as we sort of mentioned before, right now, God is letting Satan do things, but Satan's on a short leash. He can't do anything that God doesn't let him do. So in a manner of speaking, Satan and all his minions are being used as tools by God, much in the same way as nations in antiquity were used to punish other nations. So you might think of Israel getting conquered by Babylon or Assyria, for example. After that, the study talks about the kingdom of God versus the kingdom of Satan and what their attributes are. And then it also contrasts the organization of the holy angels with the organization of the fallen angels. So Satan and his angels sort of mimic the organization that the elect angels have, but it's sort of an imperfect mimicry. After that, we talk about how God is using evil spirits in the world for his purposes. Again, this is the idea of God's omniscience, being able to use the actions of these creatures, even despite what the creatures themselves would wish. So Satan is being used by God, even though Satan has plans and intents counter to what God's are. God's just smart enough and wise enough to use Satan, even though there's nothing Satan can do about it. Then we're going to talk about angelic combat. And this probably isn't so much angels flying around with swords, which is maybe what people think it is, but more about how angels, who are these spiritual forces, help and hinder us as humans in the world. And it's probably not, like I said, in such a direct physical way as we think of combat, but you might compare in scripture how there was a dispute over Moses's body. That is the sort of things that angels contend with each other with. And finally, we'll talk about unbelievers in Satan's order of battle. So unbelievers may be unwittingly used by Satan. So if you ask them, they wouldn't be, yes, I'm a person in Satan's army, even if that's what they are, in fact. After this, we'll get into what we'll call Satan's technical doctrine. So the sort of studied, systematic approach that Satan takes to deceiving us as Christians in this world. And so this section opens with 3 lies that are all common to accepting the world's point of view. So the first lie is, I don't need God. So I'm captain of my own ship. I'm capable of running my own life. Thank you very much. And we don't need God's help. That is a characteristic common to unbelief in people across history, is thinking that we are in control. After that comes the lie that I am like God. So perhaps like God in our capacity to choose or in our intellectual superiority to the animals, people start getting a swelled head and think about how great we are as humans. And then the third lie, and again, very similar to how a lot of unbelievers probably wouldn't say, oh yes, I'm in Satan's army. They probably wouldn't say, oh yes, God needs me. However, how they live their life actually betrays a belief in this concept, that people think somehow in their heads that God needs them, that they're an important part of this universe, and that without them, God's plans couldn't be accomplished, and other such insane thoughts like this. So these are the lies, the progression of slippage away from the truth in the hearts of man. After that, we talk briefly about how Satan runs the world system, this cosmos of ours. So religion and the occult, and by this we primarily mean false religion, and how false religion turns people away from the truth of actual, true spirituality for us as Christians. Then politics and society, these wider issues, economics and technology, and also amidst all of this, just the wider human institutions that are set up that often lead away, not towards the truth. So you might think of organizations in society and culture more generally. And finally, in regards to how Satan organizes systematically his tactical doctrine, we'll talk about how our perspective as believers interfaces with all this. And then the last section of the study, and boy, it will be quite some time before we get here, we'll be talking about Satan's tactical methodology. So he has the organizational plan and then his methods for implementing it. This section will open by talking about names for the devil. You may have heard Satan, of course, means adversary, but he's also called the devil, the father of lies, and other things, along these lines, and how we can learn from these names that the devil has. We'll talk about demonic influence, so how demons interact with our free will and temptation. We'll talk about demonic attack, so how demons can interfere negatively in the lives of believers, although only up to the point that God allows them to. We'll talk about demonic possession. Now, that's not something that happens to believers, but to unbelievers. And then we'll talk about accusation of believers by Satan and his forces. So I mentioned the example of Job before. That's one example in Scripture of this. And then finally, we'll talk about resistance to all of this on our part. So that's a high-level overview of the outline as we'll go through it. And as I mentioned, it will take us quite some time because this study is quite lengthy. Okay, so one question might be, if this study is so long and we have all of this depth, then as we started out with, what's the point, right? So at the very beginning slide, I mentioned that, this study was very helpful for me in seeing through some of what the world presents itself as important towards the wider spiritual realities. But now that we've gone through an outline, I'll be a little bit more specific. So here's what I say. Everything in this world, from art, culture, politics, the media, governments, corporations, false religions, and even some groups calling themselves Christian, are all part of Satan's web of lies and deceit that he has set up to trap and distract us as Christians and lead us away from the truth. If we study the tactics Satan uses in his pursuit of his objectives, we can come to see the world as it actually is and step off the hamster wheel of illusion that keeps us away from freedom and the truth. So at a high level, having gone through the introduction, this is why I think this study is useful for us as Christians. What we get out of it is being able to recognize the lies and the illusion around us in the world, and instead replace that with pursuing the truth in our hearts. All right, so this is what we went over today. We started at a high level of why I thought this study is useful for us, and then I introduced the parallel of Plato's Allegory of the Cave and how that can kind of be a useful thing for us to pull from when we discuss spiritual truth versus the illusions of the world. Then we talked about how Satan is temporarily in control of this world, but only insofar as God allows him, for the purpose of testing us and refining our faith as Christians. That's why we go through hard things, and that's why Satan is allowed to have this control. Then we talked about the outline for SR4 as on Ichthys, and sort of a sneak preview of what we'll be doing in coming weeks. And then finally, I gave another introduction as to why we are doing this after we've had a little bit more information on it.